Hello, I'm Philip Satterthwaite. Greetings to you from the study in my flat in Singapore. I also bring you greetings from my school, the Biblical Graduate School of Theology. My thanks to the faculty of the Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary for inviting me to contribute to this seminar series. And thank you for attending this seminar. Unity and diversity is an important issue in Old Testament studies. In interpreting the Old Testament, we must do justice to our conviction that all of it is inspired by a God who, though he may say different things in different contexts, fundamentally does not contradict himself. But how can we do this without flattening the diverse perspectives of the different books into an oversimplified conformity? Putting the point the other way around, how can we do justice to the diversity of the Old Testament witness without ending up by treating its different parts as effectively contradictory? I propose to explore this issue in relation to the accounts of David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings and in Chronicles. Why these accounts in particular? For at least two reasons. First, these accounts clearly exemplify both unity and diversity. For much of their length, the two accounts, without being verbally identical, run parallel to each other, unity. But significant parts of the two accounts have no parallel in the other, diversity. Second, David and Solomon are theologically significant figures. Many later Old Testament texts take up themes first introduced in the accounts of their reigns. Surely, if there is significant diversity as well as unity in the two biblical accounts of David and Solomon, figures who are so central in the Old Testament, we cannot ignore the issue. I take it that you are familiar with the narratives of David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings. Let me pick out some key points. 1 Samuel begins with the accounts of Eli and Samuel and the first part of the account of Saul. In chapter 15, the prophet Samuel tells Saul that God has rejected him as king. In chapter 16, he secretly anoints David as Saul's replacement. The rest of 1 Samuel is taken up with the narrative of the crossing fates, as Jan Fockelman has termed it. Saul's decline and paranoia leading to his death at Mount Gilboa, David's rise to power in spite of Saul's hostility to him. These chapters draw a sharp contrast between David, the man after God's own heart, and Saul. David is zealous for God's honor and full of faith in God, a skilled leader who inspires loyalty in his men and cares for them, a man, unlike Saul, eminently suited to rule Israel. Saul's death is followed by civil war in Israel between the house of Saul and the house of David. But after some years of fighting, the tribes of Israel gather to make David king. David's reign goes well for a long time. He captures Jerusalem, the last Canaanite stronghold in the land. He defeats Israel's enemies, Philistines, Moabites, Arameans, Edomites, Ammonites. He sets up administrative structures to ensure justice for his people. Yet more significantly, he brings the ark representing God's presence into Jerusalem and receives from God a promise that his sons will rule over Israel in perpetuity. The contrast with Saul, rejected by God, is again clear. But then comes adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. A shadow falls on David's reign. Rape and murder within David's family. Civil war within Israel as Absalom, David's own son, rebels against him. The rebellion is defeated, but it ends with an uneasy peace within Israel, a peace marked by sordid pragmatism. There are various underhand dealings in which Joab, David's right-hand man, plays a leading role. There are tensions between the tribes which anticipate the later division of the kingdom in the days of Rehoboam. As this part of the account draws to a close, the glory of David's earlier years has clearly been tarnished. In 2 Samuel 21 to 24, the narrator offers a summing up of David's reign, drawing on a range of texts. 2 Samuel 22 is a long psalm in which David praises God for raising him up as Israel's king and giving him victory over the nations. The shorter Oracle of David at the beginning of chapter 23, in which David commits himself to ruling his people justly, is also striking. These poetic texts have a visionary quality. They give a sense of what Israel's king can achieve when he is faithful to God. Narratives in chapters 21 and 23 suggest the loyalty which David's men felt towards him. He cared for them, and they willingly fought to him. All of this is positive. But the narrative of David's census in chapter 24 shows the harm that Israel's king may cause when he becomes proud and forgets his dependence upon God. Coming at the end of this summing up, it leaves a question in our minds. If even David, so loyal to the Lord, can go so badly astray, what disasters may his descendants bring upon Israel? The account of Solomon's reign in Kings begins inauspiciously. 1 Kings 1 to 2 depicts palace intrigues and an attempted palace coup. Solomon is finally proclaimed king, but the transition is messy. The executions of Adonijah, Joab, and Shimei raise awkward questions. But then Solomon seeks God and asks for wisdom to rule Israel. He does indeed rule wisely for a time. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. 1 Kings 4:20. Solomon builds the temple for the Lord, a clear symbol of God's presence among his people. The fact that he is permitted to complete this project is a clear sign of God's choice of David's line to rule Israel. But then Solomon receives a word from God which puts the glory of the temple in perspective. If Solomon and his descendants remain faithful to God, God will establish his throne over Israel forever. But if not, Israel will go into exile and the newly built temple will be destroyed. Again, the question is raised, what will the outcome be? From here on, the account starts to pile up worrying details. We learn that there are Canaanites still living in the land. What are they doing there? Solomon has married a daughter of Pharaoh. Should he have done so? Solomon becomes fantastically wealthy. There is a flourishing trade in horses. But didn't the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17 specifically forbid such things? What is going on here? In 1 Kings 11, the narrator, who has maintained a neutral tone up to this point, gives an explicit and strongly negative evaluation. Solomon's many marriages with foreign women led him in his old age to worship their gods. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. 1 Kings 11, verse 9. There follows Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam that Solomon's kingdom will be divided after his death, with Jeroboam ruling 10 tribes. David's line will rule over a much reduced kingdom. With that prophecy, the account of Solomon ends. What are some key features of the accounts of David and Solomon in Samuel and Kings? First, surely, their ambivalent attitude towards human leadership. Israel's leaders can clearly be as much part of the problem as part of the solution. Indeed, the accounts of Eli and Samuel in 1 Samuel 1 to 7 and of Saul in chapters 8 to 31 foreground the issue of corrupt versus godly leadership. Now, both David and Solomon do a lot better than Eli and Saul. The first half of 2 Samuel conveys a clear sense that with David's becoming king, God's purposes move closer to fulfillment. Things hoped for in earlier texts now become reality. David defeats Israel's enemies, and Israel enjoys that rest in the land which Moses anticipated in Deuteronomy 12. God's promise to Abraham of numerous descendants, seed, who would possess the gate of their enemies, is taken up by God's promise to David that his descendants, seed, will rule over Israel in perpetuity. Similar things apply to the account of Solomon. The reference in 1 Kings 4 to Judah and Israel being as numerous as the sand by the sea clearly echoes God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 15. And when both Hiram of Tyre and the Queen of Sheba praise Israel's God for having given Israel a king as wise and just as Solomon, we are reminded of what Moses hoped for in Deuteronomy 4, that Israel would follow God's commands and that the nations, seeing the character of their national life, would be impressed by the wisdom and justice of the teaching given them by their God. Samuel and Kings then portray the reigns of David and Solomon as high points in Israel's history. God's blessing is evident for much of their reigns. When David and Solomon walk in obedience to God, Israel as a whole benefits greatly, and God's purposes are significantly advanced. But when David and Solomon, in different ways, turn away from God and abuse royal power, Israel also goes astray, and God's purposes are thwarted. It may not be going too far to suggest that both Samuel and Kings regard a monarchy as an intrinsically corrupting institution, an institution that by its nature corrupts Israel's leaders and those linked to them. An important theme in the account of David's later years in 2 Samuel is the emergence in Israel of a kind of wisdom which seems to have more to do with political cunning than the fear of the Lord. With the coming of the monarchy, these chapters teach us, people learn new and dishonorable skills which enable them to flourish in this new political environment. To sum up, the accounts of David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings give much space to the negative as well as the positive aspects of their reigns. Let us turn to David and Solomon in Chronicles. David is the main focus of attention in 1 Chronicles. The first large section of narrative in 1 Chronicles, that is after the lists of chapters 1 to 9, takes us directly to David. Major events in Israel's history are passed over. There is no mention of Exodus, Sinai, or conquest. Instead, we begin in 1 Chronicles 10 with Saul. Saul as he is about to die in battle. Saul is mentioned only as a negative counterpart to David. He was unfaithful to the Lord, therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse, 1 Chronicles 10, 13 to 14. The rest of 1 Chronicles is devoted to David's reign. Much of 1 Chronicles 11 to 20 follows the outline of the first half of 2 Samuel, the support of the tribes for David, the capture of Jerusalem, the bringing up of the ark, David's proposal to build a temple, the Lord's promise to David, David's victories over surrounding nations. The narrative of David's census in chapter 21 leads to the identification of the site for the Lord's temple. Everything that follows in chapters 22 to 29 is focused on the temple, the assembling of laborers and material, the different Levitical divisions and their role in Israel's worship, David's final charge to Solomon and the people, the offerings for the construction of the temple. There's a great focus on the temple in the last third or so of 1 Chronicles. David's last words are a public prayer before the assembled tribes, after which Solomon is proclaimed as king. 2 Chronicles 1 begins its account of Solomon with the narrative of his dream vision at Gibeon. There is nothing corresponding to 1 Kings 1 to 2. Thereafter, events proceed mostly following the order of 1 Kings 4 to 10. Solomon's request to Huram of Tyre for aid in temple building, the building of the temple, Solomon's prayer of dedication and God's response, Solomon's building works and his maritime trade, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, Solomon's great wealth, and finally, Solomon's death. The points made above about the fulfillment of earlier hopes in the reigns of David and Solomon apply equally to Chronicles. In Chronicles, just as in Samuel-Kings, what was previously vision becomes reality, and God's purposes are significantly advanced. Comparing the accounts in Samuel-Kings and Chronicles, they have much in common. In the narratives of the first period of David's reign and most of Solomon's reign, we find most of the same events in mostly the same order. But there are also substantial differences. There is a greater emphasis on the unity of the tribes in Chronicles. There is no mention of the civil war which followed Saul's death. Instead, we pass from Saul's death directly to David's acceptance by all the tribes. The chronicler underscores the theme of tribal unity by bringing together in 1 Chronicles 11 and 12 lists of names of those from all the tribes who supported David both before and after Saul's death. Similarly, the transition between David and Solomon proceeds smoothly in Chronicles, with everything done openly and above board and in public. David, we're told, did all he could to prepare Solomon's way. Solomon completed all that David began and hoped to accomplish. Most notably, almost all the texts in Samuel and Kings that suggest a dark underside to David's and Solomon's reigns have no equivalent in Chronicles. The narratives of adultery, murder and rape, of revolt and civil war within Israel, of political double-dealing at the start of Solomon's reign. Finally, Chronicles has no parallel to the strongly negative evaluation which ends the account of Solomon in 1 Kings 11. There is no mention of Solomon's folly or of Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam. The general point is clear. Chronicles clearly puts a much more positive spin on David and Solomon than Samuel and Kings. Indeed, compared to Samuel-Kings, Chronicles takes the affirmation of kingship much further, as John Goldingay puts it. The chronicler's version of God's promise to David goes so far as to present the rule exercised by David and his descendants as an earthly expression of God's own rule. In 1 Chronicles 17:4, God tells David that I will confirm him, that is David's son, I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever. And the equivalent text in 2 Samuel 7 is that is David's, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. But in Chronicles, it becomes that is God's house and my kingdom, God's kingdom forever. Enhancing the dignity of David's reign even more than in 2 Samuel 7, I'd say. Similar in effect is 1 Chronicles 29:23, where you read that Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord, not the throne of Israel, but the throne of the Lord, succeeding his father David as king. Pulling all this together, it may seem that, compared with Samuel and Kings, Chronicles attempts to whitewash David and Solomon, giving a one-sided picture of their reigns, highlighting the positives and ignoring the negatives. But matters are not so simple. For one thing, the chronicler at points alludes to sections of Samuel and Kings which are not parallel in his account. And he does so briefly that he seems to presuppose knowledge of them. The references are very brief. He assumes his audience knows what he's talking about. Sometimes these allusions to other parts of Samuel and Kings are very pointed. Thus, 1 Chronicles 20 begins, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and came and besieged Rabbah. but David remained at Jerusalem. Now, that reference to David remaining in Jerusalem does not really fit in the chronicler's narrative, which immediately goes on to describe how Joab captured Rabbah, and then David then arrived to capture the Ammonite king's crown. The reference is not exactly relevant in the chronicler's account. It's apparently included to remind the reader of the longer narrative of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah in 2 Samuel. Similar in effect is 2 Chronicles 9:29, from the conclusion to Solomon's reign, from the chronicler's conclusion to his account of Solomon's reign. Now, the rest of the acts of Solomon, are they not written in the history of the prophet Nathan, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of the seer Iddo concerning Jeroboam, son of Nevat? No Israelite reader, I suggest, could have missed the allusion there to 1 Kings 11. At such points in his account, it is as though the chronicler were telling his readers, I could have said more here. Indeed, you yourselves know what I could have said. This raises the question of the chronicler's sources. Did the chronicler have access to the books of Samuel and Kings, or versions of these texts closely similar to those known to us? Are his accounts of David and Solomon to a large extent based on those in Samuel-Kings? Or are both Chronicles and Samuel-Kings independent takes on an earlier source? Independent rewritings, reworkings of an earlier source, an earlier common source. This might lead us to a different understanding of the relationship between Samuel-Kings and Chronicles. This is too big an issue to explore here. Let me simply state the following. I think it quite possible that as he produced his account, the chronicler had before him copies of Samuel and Kings closely similar, if not identical, to those known to us. Further, I believe that he assumed a familiarity with the narratives of Samuel and Kings in his intended audience. I cannot, of course, prove this. My point is simply that it is possible to conceive of the chronicler writing his account under such circumstances and producing something very like our present books of Chronicles. Certainly, I do not think that as he produced his account, the chronicler was fearfully saying to himself, I hope that no one here has read Samuel or Kings. Rather, we could sum up his stance towards his audience like this. I know that you are familiar with the accounts of Israel's and Judah's kings in Samuel and Kings. I now want to put before you another account of the same period of our history. My account will emphasize certain points that those earlier accounts did not bring out, or did not bring out so strongly as I now want to. Here is another version of a story that will already be familiar to you. See what is distinctive about my account and what you can learn from it. That, I believe, is how the chronicler intended his account to come across to his audience. And indeed, it seems to me that the accounts of David and Solomon in Chronicles make their points most tellingly to readers who know the accounts in Samuel and Kings, who are aware of what the chronicler has added, of what he has omitted, and what he has presented differently. Can we explain the differences between the accounts with reference to the different historical contexts of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, the different times at which they were each composed? Yes, I believe so. Here, for reasons of time, I must state my views briefly and dogmatically. The books of Samuel could well have reached something at least close to their present form less than a century after the events they describe. Maybe after the division of Solomon's kingdom, maybe even during Solomon's reign. Contrary to some recent suggestions, I see nothing in 1 and 2 Samuel which suggests an exilic, still less a post-exilic date of composition. Yes, these books present the negative as well as the positive aspects of the coming of the monarchy to Israel. But unlike Kings, they are not overshadowed by exile. Now, the last event described in Kings dates from 560 BC, the kindness shown by the king of Babylon to Jehoiachin of Judah after he'd been in exile for 37 years. So the last dated event in Kings dates to 560 BC. Much of Kings may have been composed long before 560, or at least maybe based on texts which were written long before that, possibly the frequently referred to books of the annals of the kings of Judah or of Israel. The present form of Kings, however, cannot be dated earlier than the exile to Babylon. It may have reached its present form during exile or shortly after it. Kings, indeed, seems to be focused on the theme of exile. It seems to address the question, how did the exiles to Babylon and Assyria come about? It may even have been written to address the question, why are we now in exile in Babylon? In answer, Kings points to the unfaithfulness of the people, and particularly of their kings. Kings describes a long decline, a decline from the glories of Solomon's kingdom, moral and religious collapse, leading to political impotence, and finally exile. A long decline, and a decline that began early. The seeds for the breakup of Solomon's kingdom, which was the first major step on the road to exile, were sown during Solomon's reign. Solomon's unfaithfulness and the judgment it drew down were an indication of where things would end up. That is, Kings' account of Solomon takes the form it does because it is written with one eye on exile. Chronicles is clearly a post-exilic book. 2 Chronicles 36 ends with Cyrus's decree of 538 BC, permitting the returns from exile to Judah and Jerusalem. 1 Chronicles 9 lists the names of earlier returnees. The genealogy of David in 1 Chronicles 3 takes us down some generations after the Babylonian exile. How much later than 538 the chronicler wrote is debated. Myself, I would be happy with a ballpark date between 425 and 350 BC. But clearly, for the chronicler, the exile is over. Returns have taken place. There has been significant resettlement and rebuilding. A new temple has been built in Jerusalem. Worship is being offered there. The different presentation in Chronicles, then, can be explained by the fact that it is a post-exilic composition. The issue that seems to drive the chronicler is, what can he say that will encourage his contemporaries, living some generations after the first returns from exile and perhaps faced with the realities of life back in the land and maybe discouraged by an apparent lack of progress? What can he say to such people to encourage them? Well, he reminds them that they have a long and distinguished history, a history that goes back to Abraham, indeed goes back to the very beginnings of human history. He points to continuities between their present situation and the past. They are back in Jerusalem, the city that God once chose as the dwelling place for his name. They worship where previous generations of Israelites worshipped. The Levites who minister in the temple carry out their duties following arrangements that David put in place centuries earlier. In short, the post-exilic generations are the legitimate heirs of Israel's pre-exilic history. And front and center in that history stand the chronicler's accounts of David and Solomon, taking about 2/5 of the books of Chronicles. These accounts, as we have noted, focus on the positive aspects of their reigns. David's powerful leadership, his military victories, the peace and security he brought to Israel, David's zeal for God and for the right worship of God, The glories of Solomon's kingdom, the building of the temple, the unity of the tribes under David and Solomon, the admiration expressed by foreign rulers at what they saw taking place in Israel. The chronicler also emphasizes the continuity between the reigns of David and Solomon. They are presented in Chronicles as two halves of a larger whole. These two reigns form a huge, solid block at the heart of the chronicler's account. One massive, undeniable historical fact, a fact or set of facts, rich in promise for the future. In his presentation, it is as though the chronicler were telling his contemporaries, yes, I know that there was a darker side to the reigns of David and Solomon. I know, you know, that things went badly in the centuries that followed. But consider all that God did through David and Solomon. What an advance that was on everything that came before. Remember God's promise to David. God chose David's line to rule Israel, to exercise God's own rule on earth. Well, God is still sovereign. Surely God has not abandoned what he began so gloriously with David and Solomon. That is how the chronicler seeks to address his contemporaries, I believe. And his vision of Israel fits in here. The chronicler conceives of Israel as ideally a 12-tribe entity. Now, the chronicler's audience will mainly be drawn from the tribes of the former southern kingdom, that is, the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. But he clearly wants to encourage in his audience a welcoming attitude towards Israelites from the tribes of the former northern kingdom. The chronicler's message to his contemporaries seems to be, if such northern Israelites share your own commitments, if they share your commitment to the Lord, to the Jerusalem temple, and to David's line, then you should welcome them with open hands, open hearts. Let them play a part in the work of rebuilding. Again, there's more I could say here, but the chronicler's vision of Israel as a 12-tribe entity is an important part of his presentation. Why did the chronicler insist on this point, put this vision of Israel before his largely southern descended audience? Well, quite likely because David and Solomon had ruled over all 12 tribes, and not just over Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. The welcome which the chronicler encourages his contemporaries to extend towards Israelites from all 12 tribes makes perfect sense. If he was hoping, if he was looking towards the day when David's kingdom might be restored in all its fullness. What then of the future? David's death does not exhaust his significance for later generations. In both Kings and Chronicles, several features of the accounts of later kings serve to keep King David before our eyes. Later kings of Judah are compared to David, either negatively or positively. Chronicles in particular makes the point that when later kings returned to God, were faithful in what they did, what they achieved came close to regaining the glories of David's and Solomon's reigns, that they were a partial return of the glories of those great reigns of David and Solomon. We see this particularly in the chronicler's accounts of Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah. 5 texts in Kings, again, refer to David. They explain the continuing survival of the kingdom of Judah with reference to God's continuing commitment to David, to God preserving Judah for David's sake. And in Chronicles, religious reform often involves reinstating arrangements which David put in place for Israel's worship. David is frequently referred to in later chapters of 2 Chronicles and in 1 and 2 Kings as well. Even after his death, David continues to be a presence in Kings and Chronicles. But what do both books have to say about the future of David's line? Well, the last verses of Kings, as I noted above, describe the kindness shown by the Babylonian king to Jehoiachin in exile. And the point of those verses at the end of 2 Kings is clear. A descendant of David lives on. David's line still survives. There is at least a glimmer of hope for the future in these last verses in 2 Kings. Chronicles, written later than Kings, might be expected to take matters further. The genealogy of David in 1 Chronicles 3 does indeed take us further into the post-exilic period, some generations beyond Jehoiachin. But oddly, it may seem, these post-exilic descendants of David are represented only by their names in 1 Chronicles 3. It seems that the chronicler had nothing to report about David's post-exilic descendants. This is linked to one of the most striking, and it may seem puzzling, features of Chronicles. That though the chronicler likely wrote his account between 100 and 150 years after Cyrus's decree, he says almost nothing about what happened after 538 BC. Perhaps he knew the accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah in some shape or form. Maybe he took the view that these accounts adequately described both the gains and the losses of the period since 538. So maybe that's why he didn't write a consecutive account of his own of the post-exilic period. Some indeed have suggested that the chronicler also wrote much of Ezra and Nehemiah. That, though, is highly disputed, and it's another debate which we must leave on one side for the moment. But did the chronicler even believe that David's line had a future? He certainly says nothing explicit to this effect. Indeed, his approach throughout is to address his contemporaries by looking to the past, not to the future. That is why Chronicles takes the form it does. It is a post-exilic retelling of Israel's pre-exilic history. So on the one hand, the chronicler's account of Israel's earlier history gives pride of place to David and Solomon, the glory and solidity of what they both achieved, the continuing significance of the promise to David. On the other hand, though he knows of descendants of David living after the exile, it seems that he has nothing noteworthy to report about any of them. And so, as an honest historian, we might say, he simply lists their names and says no more. Some scholars have argued that the chronicler saw no continuing significance in God's covenant with David, that the chronicler saw the rebuilt temple as the complete fulfillment of the promise to David, which effectively exhausted the promise's significance. The chronicler, they claim, did not expect a restored Davidic kingdom. In response, I would point to the great length of the accounts of David and Solomon in Chronicles. Why so much detail about these two kings if the promise to David had reached its goal and was now effectively of historical interest only? Note too how Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple ends by quoting Psalm 132, verses 8 to 10, and including the plea, "Remember your steadfast love for your servant David." That's 2 Chronicles 6:42, a passage with no parallel in 1 Kings 8. I suggest that in this verse, the chronicler comes as close as he ever does, to expressing a longing felt by himself and by his contemporaries for the restoration of the line of David and of something like the former glories of the kingdoms of David and Solomon. In conclusion, there is much that Samuel-Kings and Chronicles agree on in their accounts of David and Solomon. They both paint glowing pictures of David's achievements and the glories of Solomon's reign. But the accounts also differ in many respects. How can we interpret these accounts in a way that takes seriously both their unity and their diversity? The problem, in my view, is not really one of harmonization. The two accounts are clearly different in their focus, but it is possible to combine the events described in the two accounts into a single coherent narrative. It is also possible to combine the different insights of the two accounts into a single coherent theological treatment of the early Israelite monarchy. John Goldingay does that rather effectively in the first volume of his Old Testament theology. But how can we do justice to the distinctive features of the two accounts in our theologizing? Well, perhaps along the following lines. Our reflections on the account in Samuel-Kings will, I suggest, take the form of a yes, but. Yes, God's raising up of David's line to rule Israel truly showed his grace and mercy towards his people. But there was always the danger that the kings of David's line might act in such a way as to undermine God's gracious initiative through folly, pride, greed, lust, and idolatry. God's commitment to his purposes and the tendency of fallible human leaders to derail those purposes, both will feature largely in our reflections on Samuel-Kings, I suggest, and their portrayal of David and Solomon. Our reflections on David and Solomon in Chronicles will necessarily seem more one-sided in comparison. This is because the chronicler's own approach can be expressed as a different kind of yes, but. What he wants to tell us is, yes, I know that not everything about David's and Solomon's reign was glorious and uplifting, but focus on the positives. The chronicler makes clear that he is aware of the negatives. He assumes, I believe, that his readers are similarly aware of the negatives, but his main message is, remember what God did through David and Solomon. You should see what God did back then as a promise of what God will do in future. God will not give up on what he began through David and Solomon. So let my account of their reigns inspire you to faithfulness in your own day. Anything you can do, any act of worship, any act of resettlement or rebuilding, no matter how insignificant it may seem, is a step in the right direction, a pointer to the glory which is to come. God will bless any such undertakings, any act of faithfulness on your part. One way of making this point, of setting out this contrast between the two different accounts in Samuel-Kings and Chronicles, is to imagine two different takes on church history. One take on church history, following the lead of Samuel-Kings, might also go, yes, but. Yes, the kingdom of God truly did come in power through Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Truly, these events tell us that our God is a promise-keeping God. But how many disappointments there have been during the last 2,000 years of church history. How often have the church's leaders betrayed Jesus' vision and failed to model kingdom values. How carefully we need to guard against this happening in our own day. That might be a take on church history, which follows the lead of the accounts of David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings. But another take, following the lead of Chronicles and its account of David Solomon, might go, remember Jesus. Remember the resurrection message of new life and new creation. What God did through the resurrection, he will surely bring to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. And anything you can do in your church, in your society, that speaks of new life in Jesus, that authentically conveys the resurrection message to a needy world, is a step in the right direction. God will bless such steps of faith. two different takes on church history, two different perspectives, just as we have two different takes on David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings and in Chronicles. Both perspectives are necessary, surely. Both perspectives have something to teach us. If we had to choose between the accounts of David and Solomon in Samuel-Kings and Chronicles, if we were really forced to make a choice between those two accounts, many of us perhaps, remembering the exciting and moving narratives in Samuel-Kings, and then recalling the long lists of names in 1 Chronicles, might be tempted to jettison Chronicles. But I hope that my presentation has conveyed some sense of what we would lose if we failed to study the accounts of David and Solomon in Chronicles as attentively as we study those in Samuel-Kings. We should praise the wisdom of God, who has brought it about that these two accounts, with all their similarities and with all their differences, in their unity and their diversity, are both part of our scriptures. Thank you.